Greetings, AG listeners. This is Casey Turbin, owner of Good Trouble Entertainment, the company that has provided pro audio services for the AG live shows. I'm honored to sponsor this special 160th anniversary episode about the Second Battle of Winchester on behalf of Shenandoah University's McCormick Civil War Institute. This episode's featured guest is Professor Jonathan Noyalis, director of the Institute, a former professor of mine, and someone I consider a mentor and friend. Professor Noyalis has authored nearly a dozen books about the Civil War, as well as over 100 published articles. After you enjoyed this episode brought to you from Star Fort in historic Winchester, make sure you go online to learn more about some of the events taking place in 2023 through the Institute. Events like July 15th's Battle of Cool Springs 159th anniversary, which will take place at the beautiful Battlefield campus the Institute maintains and interprets in Bluemont, Virginia. That's about 20 minutes from Winchester. There's also the November 4th annual fall conference entitled Breaking the Shenandoah's Gibraltar, about the Battle of Fisher's Hill and the final days of the 1864 Valley Campaign. I'm a fellow AG supporter, Patreon subscriber, and Getty's nerd just like you, so feel free to send me an email at Casey, C-A-S-E-Y, at goodtroubleentertainment.com for any questions you may have when visiting what many folks consider to be their other favorite Civil War town, Winchester, Virginia. Enjoy the show.
Are you looking for a new home in the Winchester, Virginia area? Do you need a professional, friendly, and experienced realtor who can help you achieve your real estate goals? If you answered yes, then you need to call Laura Frapollo with Sampson Properties today. Laura has earned the GRI and ABR designations, which means she has extensive training and knowledge in the real estate industry, and she is passionate about helping people find their dream homes or sell their homes for top dollar. So if you're ready to buy or sell a home in Winchester, Virginia, let Laura help you make your real estate dreams come true. Call her at 540-664-5334 or email lafrealtor@gmail.com. That's 540-664-5334 or lafrealtor@gmail.com. Laura Frapollo, your trusted realtor with Sampson Properties.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg, the special anniversary episode. And today we are talking about the anniversary of the Second Battle of Winchester. That would be the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Second Winchester. Sitting here with me, I have two guests, both from the Winchester area. The first one, of course, is the great Jonathan Noyalis. Hello, sir. How are you?
Glad to be here. I'm good.
Welcome aboard. And the man who also gets producer credit for this episode, Casey Turbin. Hello, Casey.
Hello, good evening. Yeah.
And you are, people might know you from when we do our in-person shows. You're the sound guy.
I am the speaker guy in the corner.
The speaker guy in the corner, just told to sit there and shut up.
Just trying to keep an eye on you and make sure it goes smoothly.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. So we are sitting in the middle, essentially, of Star Fort. And what is that, Fortress Road right behind us? Is that what it's called?
So there's Fortress, Sentinel. They're all kind of named after
military things. But it's in Winchester, and it's really cool, actually. You'll just have to come here and see it for yourself. I'm not going to bother
behind the
describing.
Red Cross building.
Yes, off of, what is that, 35 you said?
No, so it's 37, 522 Junction, and Sunnyside is the name of the little area here.
Okay. If people put Star Fort in the GPS, they can find it?
They should.
Yeah, they should.
If not Red Cross, Winchester, well, there's a parking lot behind it, and you just walk up the hill.
You park in the lot and then walk up the hill, and you'll see it there. You'll see some cannons poking down, looking at you. As you're walking up the hill. So anyway, we're going to talk about the Battle of Second Winchester. If you've got the Lano map book, or if you've got Jonathan's book, My Will is Absolute Law, biography of General Robert H. Milroy, or really any book on Second Winchester that has maps in it, you want to follow along with us. That'll probably help you, I think, because we're going to be talking about the town, of course, and the forts around it and where they are in relation. And so it's best to have some kind of visual aid because we're not always going to try to stop and go. So if you picture the town and then picture a rectangle and then the northwest corner, we might do that once in a while, but we're not going to be able to do that all the time. So have a map handy. It'll make it a lot easier for you. All right. So Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the battle?
Yeah, I'm a director of Shenandoah University's McCormick Civil War Institute and a history professor at Shenandoah. I did my undergrad at Shenandoah and graduate work at Virginia Tech, so all of your listeners, I'm certain, have read Bud Robertson's biography of Stonewall Jackson, have read Jack Davis's books, so I was fortunate to get to study with those two great historians.
Wow. Yeah. Jack Davis, what's his real first name? Jack is a nickname.
William.
William.
Yeah, William C. Davis.
Yeah, William C. Davis,
Yep.
yeah. And both of them, for me, and well, you too, we're the same age, essentially. We grew up watching them on
That's right.
Civil War Journal. All those old History Channel shows when History Channel played history shows. And so that's pretty cool. You got to work with them. And are you a lifelong resident of Winchester?
So I've been here since 1997. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, so northeastern PA, Schuylkill County.
All right, very good. And Casey, you have the mic up to your mouth. You're going to say something?
Not at all. I'm just in position trying not to make noise.
Okay, very good. All right, well, let's get started then talking about the battle. And before we get to the battle, of course, we got to get to Winchester itself. We're a Gettysburg show. Everybody kind of, well, I assume everybody, but I'm sure not everybody, but most people have a good understanding of Gettysburg, where it is, maybe what it looks like on a map, things like that. Give us a little bit of background on Winchester. Go all the way back to the natives, if you will.
Yeah, so Winchester in the Shenandoah Valley, the first peoples to populate what is Winchester today in the valley were Native Americans, largely Iroquois and Shawnee were the main tribes in the Shenandoah Valley. First whites come to the valley in the 1720s. Winchester's established 1744. And, really from the mid-1700s all the way until the outbreak of the Civil War, Winchester, its surrounding area, was a largely agricultural area. Main crop was hemp, during the Rev War. There was a great need for hemp for the Continental Army. And so hemp production in the valley is actually what brought enslaved people to the valley. And so slavery was on this steady rise and increase. And then when you get to the 1820s, there's not a great need for hemp anymore, and so that's replaced with wheat. And so wheat, you think about the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the name that's always applied to the Shenandoah Valley. I don't know that name is entirely accurate, but certainly the breadbasket of Virginia, about a third of all the wheat that's harvested in the state of Virginia by the time of the Civil War comes from the Shenandoah Valley. So certainly the valley is important in supplying wheat to, and foodstuffs to the Army of Northern Virginia. There's a lot of tanneries. There's a lot of iron furnaces in the valley. But when you look at Winchester, Winchester is a community that, all throughout the late 1700s into the 1800s, it grows quite rapidly because it's a really important trade center, really important transportation hub. So Winchester sits right along the Valley Pike, which was a macadamized road that ran for about 100 miles. So the Shenandoah Valley, which stretches from Harper's Ferry all the way down to Rockbridge County, it's about 180 miles. So the Valley Pike is about 100 miles in length. Winchester-Potomac Railroad terminates just north of Winchester, which runs to Harper's Ferry, which connects to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So it really is, this important commercial center, this trade center, this transportation hub, and really one of the reasons that armies of both sides during the war felt that this was a strategically significant place.
When the war breaks out, is it immediately... Now, you said that they both saw it as strategically significant. So who was the first army to get here?
So the first forces are Joe Johnston's command. So when Johnston took command of Virginia forces, he was at Harper's Ferry. And, Harper's Ferry or Winchester, there's this great debate among Confederate high command, among the Union high command, which is the more strategically vital city. And so, people like Jefferson Davis at the outset of the war, they thought it was Harper's Ferry. And again, Harper's Ferry is a really important transportation center, not only for the railroads, but for the C&O Canal that sits at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. Joe Johnston thought that Winchester was the more strategically vital place. And so Johnston ultimately convinced Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, who was serving as military advisor at the time, to pull his command from Harper's Ferry to Winchester. But when Johnston got here, one of the things he understood, and, we're sitting in the midst of Star Fort right now, one of the things he understood is that Winchester was not really a defensible place just by the nature of the terrain. And so he ordered the construction of the very first earthwork fortification, Fort Collier, which is not too far from where we're at right now. Star Fort, where we're at, was actually the site of a gun emplacement known as Fort Alabama, constructed by those troops from Johnston's command. So you start to see early in the war this recognition. Winchester is an important place. It's a place from which, Confederate armies could threaten invasion of the North. They could threaten Washington, D.C. Federal forces see it as a place from which they can prevent, attacks on the Capitol, block those invasions. But all of these armies recognize that if they're here, they have got to do things to build and strengthen up the defenses of Winchester. And I always tell people, when I take them on tours of various sites, that, Winchester in a lot of ways is like a scale version of Washington, D.C. by the end of the war. It's pretty much completely encircled in fortifications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Star Fort, where we are now, I'm looking on a map here, it looks like it's part of a larger fortification along a ridge line, right? This wasn't the only anything up here.
Correct.
Right, this is just what remains.
Correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So it sounds to me like you're saying this is important, not because it's holdable, but because of the roads.
Yes.
And the roads, it's kind of like the same lesson that we have with Gettysburg. It's all roads lead to Gettysburg. All roads lead to Winchester, it looks like here on the map, coming in from every direction. Okay, this is one thing that we all have heard a million times. It's changed hands 72 times throughout the course of the war. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Explain to people that number.
Yeah, so we had talked about, so if you go to the visitor center and buy a T-shirt, they have a T-shirt with the logo, changed hands 72 times. And I think it's important for people to understand where that number comes from. So that number 72 is actually derived from a diary of Julia Chase. So Julia Chase, her family was originally from Maine. She was a Unionist sympathizer during the war. And again, sometimes people don't realize this because Winchester is so very staunchly Confederate. There's about 10 to 15% of the population in this city who are Unionists, and the Chases are among them. So Julia Chase, she kept a diary throughout the conflict, and every time that she saw Union soldiers or Confederate soldiers, she would write, today we're under Confederate occupation, today we're under Union occupation. And so, the number 72, it's the popular number. After the war, veterans write, it changed hands as many as 96 times. The reality is there's not 72 or 96 major occupations. There's probably about a dozen major occupations of the city of Winchester. But what's important is to understand perspective. So if you're living in this city that's essentially a revolving door, armies coming and going all the time, because, again, they understand the importance of the place. Yeah. If you're living in this very unstable environment and you look out your window and you see a patrol of 150 Union cavalry, right past your door, you're going to feel that, at least for now, we're under Union occupation. And the same holds true if you see that with Confederate forces. So a squad, when at a time when the city is not occupied by either force, but a squad, let's say, or a platoon of Confederates come through and they stay for 2 days, right? That's an occupation in her mind. Yeah, she's counting that as an occupation. And, if you look at where the number really gets inflated is in the early months of 1864. There's a lot of that kind of, a couple days a patrol is here, a couple days Confederates are here, and vice versa. And there's actually this one moment in February of 1864 where, supposedly Winchester changed hands 13 times in a single day. And again, it's a lot of this, troops coming and going and how they feel. What's the story behind that, where it changed? So they say it changed hands 13 times in one day. What are they misunderstanding? Yeah, it's just troops passing through. But I think what adds a little bit of credence to this, so there was a hotel proprietor in Winchester. He owned the Union Hotel. And so there's this probably somewhat apocryphal story of, during this particular day in February of 1864, where he sees Confederates and he's like, oh, I want to protect myself and my family and my property. So supposedly he gets a ladder out and goes up and paints over the U and the N on the sign of his hotel, so it becomes the Ion Hotel. And then he sees the Confederates leave and Federals come in, and he's like, oh, I got to put the U and the N back on. So he's up and down the ladder all day. And again, whether or not that story's true, it's kind of a local legend. But again, I think kind of emphasizes the uncertain nature of life for these people in Winchester.
Yeah. But when you say like troops coming and going, so you're saying like 13 times Union troops or Confederate troops would come in the same day, and there was no fighting?
No, it's just passing through. It's like ships passing in the night.
That's crazy,
in essence. Yeah,
that they're that close, within a day in February.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So let's move on then to 1863. That's the year we're most concerned with here. Who is placed in command here? Well, first of all, I guess go back to the end of 1862. In September, you have Antietam, and then you're going to have Fredericksburg in December. What's going on here while all that's going on?
So after Antietam, there's portions of the Army of Northern Virginia that actually pull. After they pull across the Potomac to Shepherdstown, they actually come into Winchester. Confederate wounded are brought into the various makeshift hospitals in the city. And so Confederates are here until November. And then, when Burnside takes command and Burnside starts moving to Fredericksburg, Confederate forces leave. And so there's this period, mid-November 1862 until Christmas Eve of 1862, where there essentially is no force here at all. And so, you have little bands of Confederate partisans and irregulars are roving around, but nothing of any great significance. And so on Christmas Eve, 1862, the lead elements of General Robert Milroy's division, commanded by General Gustave Paul Cluseret, comes in and occupies the city. And then that sets the stage for Milroy to show up on New Year's Day, 1863.
All right, and so then Milroy shows up. Now he's going to be in charge of a division, right?
Right. So he has 8,000 men roughly under his command.
They don't all come at once. They're not all here yet, right? By January, by the time he arrives.
Yeah. So when Cluseret's command comes in, he brings about 1,000 troops with him. Milroy brings the remaining 7,000 on New Year's Day.
Okay. And what's it like? So now the Union is now occupying the town. What's Milroy like towards the citizens?
Good question. So, Robert Milroy was a very ardent abolitionist. He was from Indiana. He was a great admirer of John Brown. And when Milroy came here, so his department commander, he served as part of what was known as the Middle Department, which was headquartered in Baltimore. Robert Schenck was his commander. So when Milroy came here, he had specific objectives he had to meet from Schenck's perspective. So one was to oversee the rebuilding of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and to protect the B&O. He was also, intended to block any Confederate attempts to, move out of the valley toward Washington or to move north. But Milroy's, personal appointed objective was to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, Milroy believed that until President Lincoln did something to destroy slavery, that the Union armies in the East would continue to suffer disastrous defeat. And, Milroy was part of the Army of Virginia at the Second Battle of Bull Run. And Milroy believed that, after the Battle of Second Bull Run, that the Union war effort was just doomed to failure because Lincoln wasn't doing anything about slavery.
So is he believing this in kind of a religious way? That, in other words, it's God who's saying, I'm not going to help you until you do the right thing.
So Milroy is a very devout Presbyterian at this point in his life. I mean, after the war, he kind of reads Charles Darwin and doubts his faith a little bit, but at this point, he's a very devout Presbyterian. And, this might not be the most popular comparison for some folks, but in a lot of ways, he's very similar to Stonewall Jackson in that regard. Like he believes, he believes that God is kind of guiding his every move. So when Milroy comes into Winchester on New Year's Day, it's actually very unseasonably warm. So it's like mid-70s. There's not a cloud in the sky. It's a bright sun. And so he takes this as, God is smiling upon him, as he comes into Winchester on the day that Lincoln's going to sign the proclamation. And then Milroy thinks about, the historical setting of Winchester. And so Winchester is the home of two very important people who are connected to the history of slavery and its perpetuation. So it's the home of Senator James Mason, who was the author of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which completely undermined the operations of the Underground Railroad. And it was also the home of Judge Richard Parker, who was the judge who presided over John Brown's trial in the autumn of 1859 and condemned John Brown to death for his raid on Harper's Ferry in mid-October. And so Milroy is taking those weather conditions, the historical backdrop, and he's believing that God is on his side. And he writes this whole series of letters to his wife. His wife eventually joins him in Winchester, but he writes this whole series of letters to his wife in January and February of 1863. Basically, God is smiling upon me. God wants me to have an Old Testament-style scourge of the land, to rid slavery from this part of Virginia. So he's really empowered and emboldened by this. Now, as you can imagine, depending on your allegiance, this determined how you would react to Milroy.
Right.
So the large majority of people in Winchester are Confederate civilians, Confederate sympathizers, so they hate him. And Milroy, I think, relishes this hate. I don't think he really cares. He sees them as traitors. He sees them as uncompromising individuals, and he is going to make life as difficult as possible for them. So he is not going to allow them, to go to stores and get food and get basic necessities of life. And he tells them, if you want those things, it's very simple. Come to my office, take the oath of allegiance, the ironclad oath, and you can have whatever you want. But Confederate sympathizers aren't going to do that, because if they take that ironclad oath and they break it, it ultimately could mean their life. Winchester, of course, has Unionist population, 10 to 15%, as I said earlier. They love Milroy. Enslaved people and free blacks, they love Milroy because they see him as their liberator. So, again, this is all about perspective. But certainly, Confederates don't like him. I'll just say, even today, among families who have descendants, who are alive in Winchester during the Civil War, they still hate Milroy. When my book came out back in 2006, I had some people who, wrote me notes or told me to my face, like, I'm going to buy your book and burn it because I hate Milroy. And at first I was offended, and my wife was like, hey, let them buy as many as they want because you still get the royalties
still
for
money,
it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's what's so funny about people who are not smart. So you said something about taking the oath.
Yes.
So Union occupation, I'm a Southern sympathizer. I take the oath to get whatever I want, but I don't want to take the oath, and I don't do it because I'm afraid if I miss a step, then I'm going to be killed by the Yankees. But also, at this point, do I know that they could be gone in a couple of weeks or months, and then the Confederates would take over, and then word might get out that I pledged an oath to the Yankees, and then now I'm going to have them to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is a real concern. And
I mean, I guess really what my question is there is, are the citizens turning on each other throughout the war, not just in 1863, but throughout the war? Because I'd imagine with now we're under Union occupation, now we're under Confederate occupation, the back and forth, you don't know who to trust. And then we'll get into the next thing I want you to talk about is how he would send Union men disguised as Confederates. We'll get to that in a second. But you don't know who to trust, even your own neighbors. And I'm sure people were ratting each other out, right? Yeah. And so if I take the oath to Milroy, or to the United States under Milroy, and then Milroy's gone, and then Confederates come in, and then my neighbor who, doesn't like me for whatever reason goes and says, hey, Matt just swore an oath to the Yankees. And then what happens to me?
Yeah. It's a great question. So in the early part of the war, and this applies not only to life in Winchester, but this whole area, Frederick County, Virginia, and the northern, or what we call the lower part of the Shenandoah Valley. So in the early part of the war, I think you had more frequently, neighbors of different allegiances ratting each other out. So for example, when Stonewall Jackson evacuates Winchester on March 11th, 1862, prior to General Banks's arrival. There are Confederate civilians saying, hey, this guy is a Unionist sympathizer. He might pose a security risk. He might tell Banks about how many troops you had or whatever, so arrest him. And you see that in the early part of the conflict. As the war goes on, you see this very interesting dynamic develop. So there are some civilians who recognize the allegiance of their neighbor might not be their own, but they recognize that if they're nice to their neighbor and they don't rat them out, that it might prove beneficial to them at some point. So if you have, and you see this certainly by 1864, if you have a Confederate neighbor, he or she is going to be unlikely to rat you out if you're a Unionist sympathizer, because they realize by this point, troops are not going to stay here in perpetuity. So it's only a matter of time before they're driven out.
The shoe's on the other foot.
Yeah. And so maybe if I'm arrested, they'll be able to help secure my release. And this happens, in those latter months of the conflict. But what's also interesting, and I don't know that there's an example of this in Winchester, but there is an example of this in Stephen City, which is just, 6 miles south of us, where you actually have Confederate civilians ratting out Confederate civilians to protect their property from being destroyed by Union forces. So when David Hunter was in the Valley in the spring of 1864, he pursued a really aggressive policy in going after Confederate civilians who supported the operations of Confederate partisans, irregulars, bushwhackers, and guerrillas. And he knew that the only way they were able to function was with the support of civilians. And so he basically said, if we find out you're supporting irregulars, we're going to burn your house down. And so there are a couple of instances in May of 1864, for instance, where Union wagon trains were attacked by partisans, and Hunter said, okay, you tested me, I'm burning down houses in Stephen City. And ultimately there was this group of Confederate sympathizers who wanted to speak with Hunter. He wouldn't talk to them directly, so he sent David Hunter Strother, who was his chief of staff, who was a Unionist from Martinsburg, West Virginia. And they basically asked, what can we do? And he said, well, rat out your neighbor. And they did. I mean, there's one Mary Wilson was a widow in her mid-60s, and they ratted her out. And ultimately, her house wasn't burned because it was rented, but the Federals took out all of her personal belongings, burned them on the street in front of her, and then drug her to Hunter's headquarters at Bell Grove in Middletown. So, yeah, there's this interesting dynamic. And really what it boils down to is I am going to do what is best for me in order to survive.
Sure.
Yeah, so allegiance kind of goes out the window. It's secondary.
So tell us about the way he would basically essentially trick people into outing themselves as Confederate sympathizers.
Yeah, so Milroy had a really curious tactic. He used Jesse Scouts.
Yeah, who were Jesse Scouts?
Yeah, so Jesse Scouts, these were created early in the conflict by General John C. Fremont. They were named after his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont. When Milroy took command of the Cheat Mountain Division in late 1862, which is in what is West Virginia today, he inherited the Jesse Scouts. So Jesse Scouts are Union soldiers who wear Confederate uniforms. And they carry, Confederate papers and documents. And what they try to do is they try to infiltrate, Confederate lines, gather up as much intelligence as possible. And Jesse Scouts were really an important part of Union operations in the Valley, not only during Milroy's time, but for the remainder of the war. I mean, Phil Sheridan used them quite extensively. But Milroy basically used Jesse Scouts to entrap the Confederate civilian population, because he had this rule that if you did anything to support the Confederate cause, so whether it was, hoarding supplies, keeping contraband items, whatever, giving aid to a Confederate deserter who might show up at your house at night, that was all, in his estimation, just cause to exile you from the city, or at a minimum place you under arrest. So when Milroy had Confederate civilians he thought were a threat, but didn't really have any hard evidence against them, he sent Jesse Scouts to their house at night. And so they portrayed themselves as, weary and tired and hungry, Confederate soldiers who needed a place to sleep or a hot meal. And so when the civilians opened the door and welcomed them in, there was a patrol of Union soldiers wearing blue uniforms who were like, hey, you're giving aid and comfort to a Confederate, which they're not really.
Right.
And that gave him cause to kick them out.
It's like the 1860s version of To Catch a Predator.
Yeah.
It's like the Chris Hansen stuff, like where you trick somebody.
And Milroy used this as justification to secure the use of the building that he used as his headquarters, the Logan House, which it still stands today in Winchester. It's a clothing store,
salon,
Kimberly's
right,
Gifts.
Boutique, that's the word.
Yeah, and so when Milroy, used that house initially, he allowed the Logan family to stay there. And then Mrs. Milroy shows up in March of 1863, and she's like, I'm not sharing a house with, all these women. And so he comes up with this scheme to basically say, you know what, you mistreated a Jesse Scout, you're out of here. And so he uses that as the justification to kick them out.
And then so he kicks that family out of their house. They had been allowed to stay with all the previous occupiers, right?
Yeah.
All the previous Union occupiers that were there. And then because the wife comes along, he kicks them out. And the daughter had a skin condition, and he wouldn't let them go and get the medication she needed. What was it? Syphilis?
Erysipelas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no.
It's like Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Pardon my French. And he wouldn't let them go and get it. So he wasn't particularly nice to the people, but he also wasn't a tyrant. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. He's not a warm and fuzzy character.
Yeah.
With Confederates, and that's by design. He hated them. He thought they were traitors. He thought they, all quite frankly, would be better off if they were dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he, the whole thing with him likening. Well, I don't know if he likened himself to Nero or who. Where does this come from? The whole Nero connection.
Yeah, so this comes from Confederate civilians.
Aha.
And so there's a group of Confederate women in Winchester, like Mary Greenhow Lee, Cornelia Peake McDonald, Kate Sperry, who are branded the quote-unquote devil diarists.
Uh-huh.
And so this is a name that was applied to the ardent Confederate women of Winchester in the spring of 1862 by Secretary of State William Seward.
Okay.
So to kind of take you back a little bit, after the First Battle of Kernstown, which was a Union victory, so this was March 23rd, 1862, Stonewall Jackson is defeated. This is a big deal because, you think about March of 62, there's not a whole lot of Union victories, especially in the East. I mean, you got Fort Henry and Donelson and, what Grant's doing out in the West. But William Seward and some other officials from the Lincoln administration came to Winchester to talk with the Union soldiers, to congratulate them. And when Seward got back to Washington, Lincoln interviewed him and said, well, what's the mood in Winchester? What's the sentiment? And Seward said, the men, well, most of them are in the Confederate Army, and the women, sir, well, they're the devil. And so, this idea of the devil diarists was born.
And so does he hear about this, that he's likened to Nero, and then does he write, with humor to someone, his wife or someone, and say, oh, they liken me to Nero or something? Yeah,
so I think Milroy, he has this kind of duality about his personality. So to Confederates, he's aware of how they feel about him. I mean, he's aware that, the Confederate government and the state of Virginia, after he issued on January 5th freedom to slaves, which was basically his decree saying how I'm going to enforce emancipation, they put a $100,000 reward out for his capture because they branded him a war criminal for that. And I think Milroy relished this. So he was aware of how, Confederate officials felt about him. He was aware of how, Confederate civilians felt about him. Your listeners can't see this, but certainly I think this is a good place to talk about it. So, Milroy had a lot of people come to him and beg him for food and, kind of have access to these basic necessities of life. And in February of 1863, he was visited by Mary Baldwin, who was, a very well-to-do woman. Her husband was a doctor, very, kind of the upper crust of Winchester society. And during the course of the conversation, there was a knock at Milroy's office door, and there were these two African-American women who were waiting to see him. And Baldwin was like, I need food for my family and for my livestock. And he's like, it's simple, lady. Take the oath of allegiance. You can have what you want. But for all those reasons that we discussed, she wasn't willing to do that. So Milroy, when he saw these two African-American women, he, welcomed them in. He said, come on in, and he kicked Baldwin out. And this was really hard for her to process and hard for her to take, because here she is, a wealthy, elite white woman, and she's being cut off and kicked out so that Milroy can talk to these two African-American women. And so she, vented to her friend, Cornelia MacDonald, who was one of those devil diarists, about this. And MacDonald said, well, let's show Milroy what we think of this. And so she created a Valentine. And so the Valentine shows Mary Baldwin, wearing a dress of red and white stripes, and coming out of her mouth as she's being kicked out of the office, and Cornelia MacDonald labeled her Miss Dixie. And coming out of her mouth is Jackson will avenge us. Milroy is sitting in a chair, telling Baldwin, out you damned rebel, and then he's pointing to the two African-American women saying, be seated, ladies. And then in the upper left-hand corner, it reads St. Valentine's Day, 1863, Winchester from a she-reb. And so when Milroy got this, and I'll pass this over, you can get a closer look at it. And there's a copy of this in my book. But when Milroy received a copy of this, he was irate publicly because he saw this as anti-union sentiment. And so he immediately ordered the search of homes. Fortunately for Cornelia MacDonald, she was never found out. But Milroy, on a personal level with his staff and with his family, he thought this was kind of funny. And so he sent it to his wife back in Rensselaer, Indiana, and he said, how do you like my looks? Ain't I getting handsome? And so, again, I think that shows a little bit of his personality. MacDonald ended up making, several variations of this, but the one that all those copies, none of them have the words on them. So it's just the image of Milroy sitting down the two African-American women and Mary Baldwin. So the one that he actually received has we saw one at the Courthouse Museum yesterday, and it had a painting on the wall of, what was it, Lady Liberty, I guess?
Yeah.
But
she
looked like...
it was like a Sambo version.
Yeah, it was like a caricature of a black person.
Like an offensive,
And by the way, Case, speak up a little more.
Yes, sir.
You don't have to be quiet over there. So but he finds it funny, but he's got to make it look like he's mad because he doesn't want them. Although I would publicly laugh at it so that they know I don't take you seriously.
Yeah.
Let's have fun with this.
Yeah.
All right. So how about Milroy's men? Let's talk about his division. He's got about 8,000 men. What is their condition? And, well, first, what is their condition? Morale-wise and otherwise.
Yeah, so Milroy's command, it's an interesting dynamic because a lot of these guys have been, enlisted in the Union Army since either 1861 or 1862. So they've been in the service for at least a year or more by the time they come to Winchester. But the lion's share of these guys have never seen combat before. And so ultimately, the combat they experienced at Second Winchester is really their first baptism under fire for most of them, not all of them. In terms of the relationship between Milroy and his men, I think by and large, the rank and file love him. Milroy is aware, obviously, that there are some members in his division who don't approve of emancipation, which isn't unique. There's a lot of Union soldiers in early 1863 who don't approve of emancipation. But he kind of explains to them, almost like a father explaining to a child, like why this matters. And so he said, I understand you're concerned about, potential of 4 million enslaved people becoming free, and if they go north, and they're going to compete with you for a job. But you have to think about what the ultimate goal here is in the war, and the ultimate goal is the restoration of the Republic. And Milroy believed, and I think rightfully so, that slavery and the restoration of the Union are inextricably connected. You can't restore the Union and still maintain slavery. And so he said, bringing about slavery's destruction is the greatest way to restore the Union. It's the quickest way to do so. And so, when he explains it in that way, a lot of those guys kind of come around to him and they understand it. That being said, they end up presenting him with a sword at Winchester. So, he's really much loved and he's popular with his troops. That being said, there are some of his subordinate commanders who don't like him all that much.
Of course.
So I mentioned General Cluseret earlier in the show. He did not like Milroy at all because he had a very different perspective with Milroy.
His name was easier to pronounce.
Right. About how you wage war. And so from Cluseret's perspective, again, he's from France. Milroy thought he was a soldier of fortune kind of guy, just wants to get glory and honor.
Right.
He thought war should be waged between armies. Milroy thought it should be waged between armies and loyal civilians of the enemy.
Sure.
And so Cluseret disagreed with him on that, and Milroy ultimately, removed him from command. Andrew McReynolds, who was one of Milroy's brigade commanders, he also had problems with how Milroy approached occupation, civilians, his generalship style. He was a little bit maybe too aggressive towards civilians for Milroy. And actually, he was one of the guys during Milroy's court of inquiry after Second Winchester who really tried to chastise him.
I have a quote here from your book on page 95, if you're following along, folks. He lived on a footing of very democratic comradeship with his men. The most extraordinary stories were told of his discussing with his subordinates what was to be done, of his permitting them to take amazing liberties with the orders to be executed. He was respected and liked by all. Obviously, not all, but most, it sounds like. So you mentioned the sword that they give him. Go into that a little bit there, because...
Yeah, so I think one of the greatest signs of affection that any command could give to their superior is a custom made engraved sword, and Milroy had actually received several swords throughout his career from his men. So the affection transcends the troops he commands here at Winchester. All of those are owned by the Jasper County Public Library in Rensselaer, Indiana. But again, I think it just is a testament to how much adoration they have for him. So it's not just guys writing, a letter home saying, "Hey, he's a great guy." It's, we're collecting hundreds and hundreds of dollars of our money. And again, you think about soldiers and how they're paid at this time.
Yeah.
They go months and months and months without getting a pay. And so, reaching deep into their pockets to contribute to this, I think illustrates the great affection they have for the Great Eagle as he was known by his men.
Didn't they go like 6 months without pay or something like that?
Yeah.
But he fought to get that for them.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
He wasn't like, oh yeah, live with it. And, but he was trying.
He was always looking out for
the
well-being of his men.
I have to say, my limited knowledge of this battle and Milroy comes from when I was researching. I do these narrative episodes where I tell like a story and sound effects and music and stuff. And for those of you listening, I put this segment before, so you already heard it. I put it at the beginning of the show. But one thing then I think that I misunderstood in the very superficial research that I did to tell a summary of what happened here is that, first of all, I think I said that Milroy likened himself to Nero. That wasn't but of course I didn't dig deep enough. Whatever I got that from was incorrect.
He says it in the quote that Jonathan uses for his book, where he's writing to his wife, and he says, "My will is absolute law. I'm a near perfect Nero," kind of saying I could have absolute power.
So then wherever
they
I
call
got
me a perfect Nero,
they call me. Okay,
yes,
see that's different than likening yourself to Nero.
Right.
And so when I read that, I assume, well, this guy's a prick. and so I did not get the right idea of him, and didn't need to for that segment. Except I think that one line there I would redo if I could, which I can, but I won't. I'm too lazy. So here's the correction. We're doing it right now. But let me just read to you to help kind of redeem myself for that mistake. I just want to drive home that he wasn't as bad as we may think, or as I may have thought. This is the inscription on the sword. It says, "To General Robert H. Milroy, a true patriot and hero, a man who loves his country and race, a soldier who acts fearlessly and promptly, a chieftain to honor and follow." So, sounds like they like the guy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What's the part about the race, though? Would that be considered, of course, today everything's considered white supremacy, but would that be in that vein back then where he was a lover of his own race over all others, or is that the Union race?
I actually think, and again, this is my speculation here. I actually think this is a reference to him loving the human race.
Okay.
Because Milroy, is not a white supremacist. I mean, he's an abolitionist.
Right, he's an abolitionist, yeah.
His men are aware of the fact that he's an abolitionist.
But there were some abolitionists who were white supremacists.
Yeah, and that's right. Just because, and again, I tell my students all the time, like, just because you disagree with the institution of slavery doesn't mean you believe in equality.
Exactly.
So I really think it's a reference to Milroy and the human race. Yeah.
All right, that makes more sense there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so where do we leave off? Okay, so let's move on to May of '63,
Yeah.
Battle of Chancellorsville.
Right.
Big deal for the Confederates.
Mm-hmm.
Nice victory.
Mm-hmm.
Word of that has to reach here, right?
Yep.
What is Milroy's reaction to that?
So Milroy, after the Army of Northern Virginia's victory at Chancellorsville, he starts. I think he maybe initially anticipates something might happen, and so he starts, gathering up as much intelligence as he can. And again, Jesse Scouts play a really important role in intelligence gathering. What's interesting about all of this is his scouts are telling him, we're going to be attacked. More than likely, it's going to happen on June the 10th, as they're kind of pacing, the movements of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Milroy sort of takes this, okay, thanks for the information, but let's wait and see what happens. And so there is this interesting dynamic of Milroy being aware of what scouts are telling him, but his heart is here in Winchester. And so Winchester by early June of 1863 is not just a place to him that is strategically significant. It is a place where he is giving people the opportunity to have their freedom. This is a place where he's providing safety and security for white Unionists. And so it's not as simple as, okay, I think we're going to be attacked. Let me ask General Schenck for permission to get out and leave. Because Milroy knows he's not going to be able to keep all of those, the freed people and the white Unionists safe. Milroy believed, and I think he thought this from day one of his entrance into Winchester, that with the fortifications he constructed, so, we're sitting in Star Fort, which he built on the site of Fort Alabama. The expansion and additional strength he added to what ultimately in 1863 comes to be known as Fort Milroy. Prior to that, it was called Flag Fort or Banks's Fort or Fort Garibaldi, because it was built originally by Garibaldi Guards in 1862. And then he constructs West Fort, kind of north of where we're at now, and then all these other series of redoubts. So Milroy believed that with his fortifications, he could easily fend off an attack of a force that was at least 3 times his size. So he has 8,000 troops. So again, he's thinking, if I'm attacked by 24,000 or less, I'm good and I can stay here. What's interesting about this is on the very day that Robert Milroy was told by his scouts that he would be attacked, June the 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Don Pyatt, who was the chief of staff for Robert Schenck in Baltimore, was sent to Winchester to inspect the fortifications, because Schenck had been getting all these letters from Milroy saying it's strong, I can defend against, a force that's 3 times my size. And so Schenck sent Pyatt to look at it. And Pyatt's initial investigation, so he's here on the 10th and the 11th of June looking around, and of course no attack happens on the 10th. And so Milroy says, see, I told you so. So that, you're reporting your intelligence is maybe skewed a little bit. So Pyatt, looks around at all the fortifications. He looks at the artillery in those fortifications. Yep, it's strong. I think Milroy's right. So when Pyatt leaves, he tells Milroy, you're good to go. Just stay put. That's what Schenck wanted him to do. But then when Pyatt is making his way back to Baltimore, his first stop from Winchester is Martinsburg. And when he gets to Martinsburg, he gets a telegraph message from Henry Halleck. And Halleck never thought that Winchester was an important place. Okay. He thought Harper's Ferry was much more important. And so Halleck tells Pyatt, yeah, I know what you saw, but I really don't think this is the case. We have to get Milroy from Winchester because he's going to be gobbled up. Because they know that, Richard Ewell's corps is spearheading this advance toward Chester Gap near Front Royal into the Shenandoah Valley, and Milroy is going to be targeted because there's no way the Army of Northern Virginia is going to launch an invasion into Pennsylvania and leave a Union garrison of 8,000 men presumably behind them.
Yeah.
And so, it's at this point that Milroy starts receiving messages, but there's this weird kind of triangle of communication. So you've got Milroy receiving telegraph messages from Schenck, and Schenck is telling him, make preparations to withdraw from Winchester, but stay put and await further orders. Halleck is saying to Schenck, I think Milroy should get out of Winchester, but again, kind of obeying the chain of command. Milroy can only accept the orders and the directives from General Schenck.
Right.
So Schenck is the one saying, stay put. What ends up happening is once Confederate forces show up on June the 12th in Middletown, Virginia, so about 10 miles south of where we're at now, that's when it kind of gets real for Milroy, and he's looking for instructions and directions. The problem is Ewell cuts the telegraph lines. And so Milroy doesn't have that line of communication with Baltimore or Washington. He does make an effort to repair the lines, but there's a terrible storm that rips through on the night of the 13th into the morning of the 14th. And so, again, those telegraph lines are essentially down. He's cut off from his communication. But the last message he receives is, make preparations, but stay put. And so he doesn't receive any of those other messages, which ultimately are telling him to get out of Winchester.
Is there no other line, like maybe that doesn't go to Baltimore, but maybe goes up to Harper's Ferry or somewhere that they could kind of relay a message?
Nope. So all those lines are cut. There were telegraph lines that ran, not only from like Winchester to Harper's Ferry and Harper's Ferry to Baltimore, but Milroy had telegraphs within his fortifications.
Right.
So one of the very cool stories, Star Fort, for many, many years, it was overgrown. People dumped garbage here. And so it's really great that, the Battlefield Foundation has preserved and interpreted and protected the site. But I was part of the team of historians. It's probably been it's been probably closer to 15 years now. And one of the things that we found up here was a piece of telegraph cable. Huh. And that was, we were able to date it with, to the time of Milroy's occupation. But yeah, all those lines are down. He has no way, unless he sends a courier, to get that information out of here. And, with Ewell's Corps approaching, and ultimately you don't know where other Confederates are, I wouldn't want to be that courier who says, go to Harper's Ferry and, send a message.
Well, right. And so Ewell is he's coming down the valley, and he's got his, 3 divisions, right? Mm-hmm. And what is his plan? How does he decide he's going to take Winchester?
Yeah, so his plan, there's a couple of elements to it. So he is going to use Edward Johnson's division and Jubal Early's division to deal with Milroy at Winchester. So he basically approaches Winchester on the Valley Pike and also the Front Royal Road, so what is Route 11 and 522 south today. And then he sends Robert Rhodes around Winchester north to Martinsburg, because there's a small Union garrison in Martinsburg that he also wants to deal with. So, Ewell has been given very clear instructions, so it's not like, what happens at Second Winchester isn't an accident. This is all orchestrated. It's all planned. Ewell understands he has to, clear Milroy. He has to clear that small federal garrison from Martinsburg. And so, he has, Ewell, say what you will about his generalship after this. I think, what he does at Second Winchester, he's very methodical. Everything is well thought out. And it's probably one of his more shining moments as a commander.
Yeah, I'm one of the people who actually defends him at Gettysburg, mm-hmm. and I think that his performance at Gettysburg is in line with the way you describe it here. Mm-hmm. That whole take the heights beyond the town impracticable thing, I think he looked at everything that he had to deal with mm-hmm. and found it impracticable mm-hmm. to try to take those heights. Mm-hmm. And only we know that he could have easily taken him with a brigade mm-hmm. because there was only a regiment up mm-hmm. there. Or mm-hmm. I don't even know if it was a full regiment at that point. And so, but for the longest time, the pop history has been that he just kind of had all this success and then just kind of said, "Oh, let's take a nap, guys."
Yeah.
But they never mention what, reports that he's getting about what's coming in on his left, and how that would, affect him, how tired his troops are, how disorganized his troops are. I think he did exactly what any smart person would have done in that situation.
Yeah, and you think about the whole practicable aspect of this in terms of Second Winchester. So, obviously as he pushes, from Front Royal over to Middletown and then north to Winchester, he's thinking in his mind, like, do I make just a direct frontal assault against the town? And so, he is aware, through his intelligence network about Milroy's fortifications. And so he knows, like, Fort Milroy is the largest fortification. If I come through town, that is going to be the first fortification I hit. Yeah. Star Fort's second largest. And so he's looking for the most practicable place to attack, and that's West Fort. And so, when you have the kind of precursor to Second Winchester, the fighting on the 12th at Middletown, fighting in Kernstown on the 13th, and that kind of pushing to the southern outskirts of Winchester, Ewell makes this decision to kind of cut Jubal Early loose with his division, have this kind of circuitous, 10, 11 mile flanking march around Winchester, get north of West Fort and attack West Fort. And West Fort, he thought, if we can take that, then we can focus on Star Fort. And then if we can take Star Fort, focus on Fort Milroy, and Milroy would be defeated.
And I guess the idea of taking the forts that are basically northwest of the town, as opposed to just waltzing up from the south and taking the town, is why? Because eventually he'd have to pass the forts and then he'd be under their artillery?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of considerations. So one of those considerations would be, if he's coming through the city, and again, we're kind of surrounded by development today.
It's very hard to imagine.
And it's kind of hard to imagine. But, I mean, this whole area was largely open. And so Star Fort, the guns in Star Fort, Baltimore Light Artillery, the heavy guns inside of Fort Milroy, they're going to be staring right at Richard Ewell. So he understands this is not an ideal situation. I think the other concern for Ewell, and this was also a concern of the civilians, is if I move through the city and Milroy opens fire, the civilians can become targets. And so there really was this concern among the civilians, Confederate civilian population, that if things go badly for Milroy, that he would open fire on the town. And so, he had told the civilians earlier, Confederates, he's like, if the situation ever gets terrible and I'm attacked and I'm driven out, he's like, I will burn this whole place to the ground. And so, that he doesn't do it, but that thought, of course, is coursing through their minds.
Okay. So, June 12th, Ewell's getting into position, basically, right? How is, so we've got, what troops where? So we've got Star Fort, Fort Milroy, West Fort, and then where's McReynolds sent?
So McReynolds, he actually spends most of Milroy's occupation in Berryville, which is just east of us in Clark County. But when the Confederates show up, in that second week of June, Milroy immediately orders McReynolds from Berryville to Winchester. So McReynolds' entire brigade is going to take position where we're at right now in Star Fort. So the Baltimore Light Artillery, they're going to, be the artillery in here. There's a whole massive network of rifle pits on the outer perimeter of Star Fort, which have largely been lost to development. So that's where the infantry from McReynolds' brigade is going to be. And then you're going to have the other elements of Milroy's command. So in West Fort, you're going to have one artillery battery up there. You're going to have troops from the 116th and 110th Ohio. And then the lion's share of Milroy's command, so General George Washington Elliott's brigade and Colonel William Ely's brigade, they're going to be in Fort Milroy.
So this is something I meant to do before we got into the battle. Give me the order of battle so that we have an idea. So he's got his division.
Yeah.
He's got, 3 brigades?
3 brigades.
All
so,
right.
Commanded by General Elliott, Colonel William Ely, and McReynolds.
All right, and then so Elliott's got, 5 regiments? 4 infantry and 1 cavalry. Ely, did you say Ely or Eli?
Ely.
Yeah, he's got, let's see, 4, same thing, 4 and 1. And then Rick Reynolds has only 2 infantry regiments and 1 cavalry regiment. Okay. And so that's about 8,000 men, though. All that. All right. Very good. And then there's also artillery.
Right.
Don't forget about Ely's 87th Pennsylvania.
Don't you forget about it. I didn't forget. I'm looking right at it.
All these.
Well, right. That's a good point. The 87th Pennsylvania, where our buddy Jack Skelly is also part of this. And they're pretty heavily involved. I mean, they're at what? Are they at West Fort or are they?
So they actually are some of the troops initially who encounter Ewell. So Colonel John Shaw commands the forces at Middletown. So they are some of the first troops from Milroy's command to engage the lead elements of Ewell's command.
Middletown is where? South of
Winchester.
Yeah. Okay. So initially they're in the way of Ewell's advance,
right,
and then fall back,
right,
and then they're sent to West Fort.
So 87th is going to be in Fort Milroy.
I'm sorry, Fort Milroy. Yeah. Okay. I'm looking right at it, and I said the wrong thing. Got it. All right. So now Ewell decides I'm going to hold him by the nose on the south end of town from Bowers Hill with Gordon's brigade. And meanwhile, what's he doing?
So once he and I think he's quite smart to do this. So Bowers Hill was the key during the First Battle of Winchester on May 25th, 1862. So I think he's quite smart to hold that position. But while Gordon is there, Early is taking his men, marching around Winchester, getting north of West Fort on the 14th.
And I think you kind of describe it. You don't use this term, but it sounds like the strategy is kind of like the domino effect.
Yes.
We're going to take West Fort. It's aptly named. It's the westernmost fort.
Right.
Take that first. That would command Fort Milroy, or am I getting it?
Star Fort.
It would command Star Fort,
right,
which would then command Fort Milroy.
Correct.
But you mentioned something yesterday about how when they were building the forts, they took into consideration the range, artillery range.
They did.
All right, go ahead and go to that.
Yeah. So I think this is brilliant. So I think Milroy and his officer corps, they understood the history of Winchester. Like, this was a place that had already had one major battle fought and a host of other skirmishes, and so I think he knew it was only a matter of time before he was attacked. So what he did was he ordered that the distances between the fortifications be measured, so that in the event like West Fort falls, which it does on June 14th after Early successfully takes it, and Confederate artillery opens fire on Star Fort or Fort Milroy, we know exactly what the distance is. We can cut our fuses accordingly and fire with deadly accuracy. And actually, that's what happens. I mean, once the Confederates took West Fort, and they turned those captured Union guns on Star Fort, the gunners of the Baltimore Light Artillery, who are the artillery inside of Star Fort, they knew exactly how far it was from here to there, and they're firing with deadly accuracy and making life extremely difficult for Confederate artillerists.
So it wasn't that they built them to be out of range of each other; it was that they just studied what the range was, so they knew they could have effective.
Yeah, I mean they built them on the ridges that were most commanding, and again with the development, it's kind of hard to get a sense. But I mean where those three main fortifications are, it is on really commanding high ground.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't about keeping them out of range, it was about knowing the range.
We saw a picture yesterday. I don't remember if it was here. No, it would have been up here, because I don't think we were looking at pictures up here. It might have been at the museum. There was some picture you showed me, and I was like, wow, there's no trees at all. And, not to mention, obviously, there weren't any modern developments. So that was at the museum.
That's the picture after the battle when they're there's this photo where they had the consolidation of everything they've captured. It's almost like when the police have like a drug bust and they stand at the table with all those. That's kind of what it is. And that one's actually blown up in the courthouse museum. But in that image, you can see that these are clear fields of fire all the way around.
I mean, there's like maybe one tree in the whole picture, and it's very hard to imagine today. We're up on a hill. It's very obvious you're on a hill because you got to walk up it to get here, so you're winded, And but you can, and of course, in any direction that we look at outside this fort, the first thing you see is a wall of trees, which of course we're not
Well, yesterday
here.
when we were on Bowers Hill, what you're talking about, it sits behind Hanley High School. If
Yeah.
you're familiar with Winchester, and it's once you get up the hill and turn around and you're coming back down Jefferson, you really get a perspective for how high you're sitting over the
It
hills.
is high. And also, by the way, you mentioned the high school. Holy crap. The high schools here are like stately
Telecounty
English
boy, let me tell you.
manners. My God.
That is not where I went.
It's nothing like mine would look like just like typical like Soviet institution. It's just nothing to it.
Consistently, when they do the top 10 most attractive high schools in the country, it's always top 2.
Well,
up there.
it's something out of
It's
some
worth the
TV
trip
show.
to come down and just walk around
Just
the
to look at
track
the high
and see-
school.
Yeah, truly. So.
Really.
If you like columns.
Yeah, no, it's full of columns. So that's the one thing. If you are going to come here after listening to this and try to go around, it's very hard to visualize everything. Which again is just another reason why I love the tree removal at Gettysburg. That because and also the you say wintertime is the best time to come here, same as Gettysburg, because you can see through the trees and you can get a better idea of things. So maybe you want to do that. Wait for the leaves to fall off the trees again. All right, so. So there's a rain between the 13th and the 14th. Does that interrupt operations at all?
Yeah, I mean it's more than rain. It's like one of the mothers of all
deluge.
storms. I mean it's
Yeah.
it's terrible. Lightning and thunder. Guys from the 116th Ohio, 123rd Ohio, who are serving as pickets near Bowers Hill. Just write about how god awful and treacherous it is that night. And that's a storm actually that takes down telegraph lines that Milroy's men were trying to repair. It takes them down, and so they kind of abandon all hope of getting any messages out or even trying to rebuild those telegraph lines.
So when the battle gets fully underway, walk us through it step by step, and I'll interrupt you if I have a question.
Yeah, so I mean we could take it. You want to take it from the 14th?
Take it from the 14th when the real
14th.
fighting starts.
Yeah, so the 14th, it's late afternoon. Early's division, they launched their attack against Star Fort. And it's not easy for, I mean, you would think that with a division.
That was West Fort, you mean? No,
Yeah, West Fort.
West Fort, yeah.
You would think that a division against really one regiment and a few companies of another, so 116th, 110th Ohio, it would be relatively easy, but it was not. So one of the things that's important for the listeners to understand, the guys in the 116th and 110th Ohio were armed with Henry repeating rifles. So they're not using the standard Springfield or Enfield rifled musket. They're armed with Henry. So a Henry has a magazine that has 15 round capacity, and so they're able to keep this tremendous fire. There's all kind of obstacles that Milroy's men have erected out in front of West Fort, and again, it's on a commanding piece of high ground. So most of West Fort, if people come to try to find it, there's essentially nothing left, but the farmland, what's known as the Yonley Farm, where Early's men crossed through to attack West Fort, it's still there. It's private property, but you can get a really good glimpse of it from the Virginia Farm Market. And then as you go up, Route 37 pretty much destroyed West Fort, but you can still get a sense of the nature of the terrain and the commanding position. And so it was really a difficult thing for Confederates to navigate. And so during the time of the battle, that was largely wheat and corn fields. But once they got to the slopes of West Fort, the slopes were so steep that obviously the artillery inside isn't able to train their cannon down. And the Confederates, they scurry to the top, and there's some pretty intense hand-to-hand combat that takes place, and ultimately the Confederates are able to overwhelm. So for the Ohio soldiers who aren't captured there, they scurry and they head towards Fort Milroy. And then you have Confederate artillery in West Fort. They open fire on Star Fort. So this is late evening into the night, so as the sun is beginning to set. So there's this massive artillery duel that happens between Star Fort and Confederate cannon in West Fort. And it's interesting, and we talked about this yesterday, and I always tell groups when I bring them up here about like this simultaneous excitement among the residents of Winchester and this crazy anxiety. because they had never seen an artillery bombardment at night before. And I've never seen one. I imagine it
I haven't either.
pretty interesting to look at.
Must be
and
cool.
so people are coming out of their homes and they're climbing to rooftops and they're catching a glimpse of this. But also they're thinking, okay, we have to realize that this is not a pyrotechnics show. This is a battle.
Right.
And so they're thinking about Confederate civilians in particular are thinking, well, what if Milroy, decides to turn those guns south into Winchester? So, there's a lot of that fear. What ultimately ends up happening that night as the sun goes down, so the Confederates are not going to launch any, infantry assaults against Star Fort. And it's interesting, there are these accounts from Union soldiers in McReynolds' brigades who are infantry manning the rifle pits. They write about what they think are attempted Confederate infantry assaults. Confederates don't write anything about this. So it might be more, imagination. It might be skirmishers deploying, but there are no, major infantry assaults against this position. So when the sun goes down and the artillery bombardment stops, Robert Milroy understands he has to make a decision. Do we stay and do we fight? Do we surrender? What do we do? And so he gathered his brigade commanders together that evening, that night, about 9:30, 10 o'clock. And he laid several options on the table. So option one was, let's just raise the white flag of surrender and, become POWs. This was not something that Milroy was a fan of. Milroy was not a guy who liked the idea of surrender. He understood, and some of his brigade commanders were trying to make the case, well, at least this would save lives. And Milroy's like, I think it's cowardly to just surrender. Mm-hmm. One of the other options that he puts on the table was to just stay and fight. And Milroy thought, I have the ordnance and I have the strength of fortifications to do that. He still believed at this stage of the game, he could be successful. But his brigade commanders kind of dissuaded him from that. And so really the only viable option was to escape, to get out. And so Milroy's hope was that he could, get out quietly without raising any suspicions among Richard Ewell, and he could make his way to Harper's Ferry. So Harper's Ferry is the only viable place where he can get to. So he issued orders to his commanders that night, destroy anything that can't be taken with you, can't be carried. So, the cannon are spiked, wells, whether it's at Star Fort or Fort Milroy, ammunition, supplies are dumped into them, powder magazines are blown up. I mean, we're sitting here in Star Fort and the exploded powder magazine is just behind us.
Mm-hmm. I noticed there's another hole over there. Is that also a powder magazine?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Or was that maybe a dugout for...
It might be.
Like the commander or something.
And so, when Milroy gave this order to spike the guns and destroy all this stuff, there were some, battery commanders. So, Lieutenant Alexander, who commanded Captain Alexander, who commanded the Baltimore Light Artillery, he wanted to take his cannon with him. And so he came up with this proposal to Milroy. He said, we'll wrap the wheels in blankets. And he's like, that'll deaden the sound. And Milroy's like, no, I don't think that's going to work. And so, much to his, reluctantly, he had to order those guns to be spiked. So, about 2:30, 3 o'clock that morning, Milroy's divisions, it's his division is leaving the various fortifications. And the ultimate goal is, if we can get to the old Charlestown Road, that'll carry us to Harper's Ferry. That'll carry us to safety. Richard Ewell anticipated that this would happen. And so he knew that there really was only one escape route, and that was the old Charlestown Road. And so what he had done was he sent Edward Johnson's division, and Johnson and Milroy had a history together. I mean, they had fought each other in 1861 in what is West Virginia. They fought each other at the Battle of McDowell in May of 1862. And so Johnson was actually chomping at the bit. He thought that this was his opportunity to get Milroy. And so
They knew each other before the war?
I don't think they knew each other before the war.
So the rivalry
But
was just
they
more
had
of
a battlefield
sportsman-like
rivalry.
battlefield rivalry. Yeah, okay.
And so Johnson is sent around to block off the old Charlestown Road. So in the area north of Winchester, what's known as Stevenson's Depot. And so he's waiting there with his division, and Milroy's column is marching up the Martinsburg Pike, and they're in a column of fours. Johnson's division is in battle line, and they open fire, and it's just a disaster for Milroy's command.
Yeah, so were they along the railroad? Is that where they were?
Yeah, they're behind
Depot?
that rail cut there. Yes.
So yeah, and so we were just out there yesterday. It's not very far from the road, and I could imagine you're just marching along, thinking, "Phew, we made it out!"
Yeah.
And then
all of a sudden,
the ridge line or the railroad, I guess, embankment.
You're talking
on
3
fire.
or 4 in the morning too, not exactly
right? And so
Yeah.
you're not expecting anything, and then all of a sudden, like everything lights up.
Yeah.
yeah, that's got to be crazy.
Yeah.
So while that's going on. What's going on? So is Winchester completely Yankee free now, or is it?
Winchester is completely Yankee free. There are civilians, and Carrie Randolph Jones comes readily to mind. She wakes up that morning, and again, she can kind of hear what's going on north of town at Stevenson's Depot, and she writes. Interestingly enough, for the first time in 6 months, we are free.
Yeah,
those are the words that she uses. Which, of course, the black people who are not free
now. They're
any
not
longer.
free anymore. Yeah.
And so, Milroy is surprised, and it's pandemonium. I mean, he tries to, organize elements of his command. Other officers try to organize elements of his command, but really, he literally loses half of his division, 4,000 troops roughly, captured north of Winchester.
Yeah. So now, I think the other thing, I don't know if I explicitly say it in that narrative or if I just imply it, but I guess I didn't read about the story of Milroy trying to rally, I guess basically whoever would rally to lead a charge. I just imagined him running ahead of the division, getting the hell out of Dodge. But he actually was trying to, put up some kind of stand.
87 Pennsylvania was part of that contingent that he tries to rally and mount some kind of a counterattack.
That's where Scully is wounded at.
Right.
Is at that part of the battle.
Right. So go ahead into that a little bit. What's going on with that story?
So at this point, Milroy again. He's trying to take the troops that are available to him. So the 87 Pennsylvania is there. They're kind of near the head of the column, and so he tries to launch this counterattack. It fails, and this is that point, where Jack Skelly is wounded, and then ultimately, becomes one of those 4,000 who's captured. And this kind of gets into that really important Gettysburg connection, aside from Second Winchester being the precursor to what happens at Gettysburg. Once Wesley Culp, who was in the 2nd Virginia, finds out after the battle about Skelly's wounding, he visits with him, and of course, Skelly gives him a note. Give it to Jenny Wade, and there's all kind of speculation about what's in the note and who ultimately knows. And then we all kind of know the sad story where Jack Skelly ends up dying in Winchester in a hospital on July 12th. Culp is killed at Gettysburg. Jenny Wade is killed, and so they all die not knowing the fate of these individuals who were such important parts of their childhood.
That's the official story.
Yeah.
If you want to go along with the Jenny Wade Industrial Complex. But anyway, so Milroy is unsuccessful in leading this charge.
Right.
But Johnson sees Milroy.
Correct.
And what does he do?
Yeah, he chases after him.
This is kind of like Stuart and Kilpatrick.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, half of his division is captured. Those troops who haven't been killed or wounded, and Milroy, suffers, about 400 guys who are wounded and killed at Second Winchester. So these troops scatter in all directions. So some troops actually make it to Harper's Ferry. Some troops get way off course and make it out to Bloody Run, Pennsylvania, which is Everett today. So in southwestern Pennsylvania. So talk about getting way off course.
Yeah, really.
And Milroy is determined to get to across the Opequon Creek and to make his way to Harper's Ferry. So Johnson sees this and he's like, "Here's my chance," and he chases after him. Milroy gets across the Opequon. Johnson's horse stumbles and falls. And he misses that opportunity. So Milroy was like right there. He saw him, and he just eludes him.
Now, what's that word that you're saying that begins with O?
Opequon.
Opequon.
Yeah. People who are not from the valley,
Opequon.
Well, that's exactly how people who are not from here will call it. They'll call it Opequon.
Yeah.
But it's Opequon.
But so anybody who heard that and was like, "What the hell is he saying?"
Yeah.
He's saying Opequon, but for some reason, the local pronunciation is Opequon.
Yeah.
the correct pronunciation is Apaquan, right?
Or a Peckin.
Well, but how would the Indians have pronounced it?
A Peckin. It's an
They
Indian,
would have said
it's an
a
Indian
Peckin?
name. Yeah, it's an Indian name.
I don't believe that.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like it to me. I think Apaquan is what they would have said.
Okay. We'll agree
Watched
to
enough
disagree.
westerns to know.
Yeah, exactly.
I know how they talk.
Please, I'm an expert on Native Americans because I watch westerns, so I know all their languages. All right, so the Confederates have the city. It's for now. Let's not forget, Lee is invading the North.
Right.
One of the reasons why is supply, and so this is a great start to basically a shopping spree.
Right.
Right. What does Ewell come away with?
So, well, Ewell actually comes away with, and I hate to use this word, but he comes away with property that is actually quite useful to the Confederates, and that's African Americans. And so, I mean, there's all the traditional kind of spoils of war, foodstuffs and those types of things. Obviously, the guns that were spiked can be captured and re-drilled and used at a later date.
Right.
But when Milroy retreats, and it's important for people to understand this. So you have his division getting out. Following his division is another column of civilians, largely, probably several thousand African Americans who are getting out because they understand that their freedom is no longer protected as long as Richard Ewell or any Confederate forces are here.
Are they following Milroy's?
Yeah,
Milroy's
they're
men?
following Milroy's division. And so, I mean, could you imagine you have the pandemonium of Milroy's column, and then you have, sutler wagons, you have civilians, African Americans trying to get out, and some of them will get out. Some of them will make it safely into Pennsylvania, only to be recaptured by troops from the Army of Northern Virginia as they make their way north. But there's a contingent of about 300 blacks who are captured by Ewell's men north of Winchester, and immediately Ewell sees an opportunity to impress these African Americans into the Confederacy service. Because, in December of 1862, Governor John Letcher of Virginia issued an order stating that every county in Virginia had to supply a certain quota of enslaved people to work on the defenses of Richmond. Obviously, Winchester and Frederick County, Virginia, Clark County, they weren't able to supply their quota.
Sure.
Now they are.
So when you say impress,
Yeah.
okay. To impress meaning
Yeah, impress
kidnap.
Meaning you're kidnapped
Forced into.
and you're forced into service, and you are forced to labor as a slave. And, we don't know a lot about the identities of most of those 300 approximately who were recaptured, but we know some of them. And to me, one of the most powerful stories involves a free black man from Stephen City. His name was Lee Jenkins. So Lee Jenkins, this guy was born free. He had worked as a blacksmith prior to the war in Newtown, so today it's Stephen City. And when Milroy came to Winchester in January of 63, Jenkins came here and he offered his services to Milroy. He said, I will help you however possible, because he recognized that even though he's technically free, he's not going to enjoy any sort of stability in his life unless slavery is destroyed and emancipation really truly takes hold. So he works for Milroy as part of his intelligence gathering network. So Milroy had a network not only of Jesse Scouts but civilians who were employed as secret detectives spying on Confederates, and so Lee Jenkins worked for Milroy, and on June 15th, when Milroy leaves, he's part of that group of several thousand African Americans who is heading north. Hopefully, they'll get to Harper's Ferry. Jenkins is captured at Stevenson, and those soldiers and those sutlers and those African Americans, they're brought back into Winchester, and they're actually held in the fortifications. So, Star Fort was a holding place. Fort Milroy was a holding place. And so whether Jenkins was actually in Star Fort or not, it's difficult to say. But 8 days after the battle was over, there was a column of, several hundred African Americans who were being marched south, and the eventual destination was Richmond. And, Lee Jenkins, he wasn't a slave. He didn't, he had never been enslaved, but he saw slavery, and he knew what it was like. He knew what ultimately his life would become. And so he made a very, very dramatic decision when that column was marching through Stevens City and got to near the southern outskirts of the community. He broke from the ranks of that column, ran to a property he knew well. It was owned by Dr. Thornton McLeod. He jumped headfirst into a well and committed suicide. So death at that moment was his only, in his estimation, his only viable option to escape slavery. And I've had people ask me this at conferences and stuff. Well, how did Confederates know if somebody was a free black or slave? I'm like, they're not looking for your papers. So as the Army of Northern Virginia moves into Pennsylvania, there are numerous accounts in the areas around Greencastle, for instance, where enslaved people from the Valley who left in 1862 or earlier in 1863 end up getting captured by Confederates. They're not asking for your papers. They're judging you by the color of your skin.
There were free-born black people in Pennsylvania who never went south of the Mason-Dixon who were captured and brought into slavery. So, it was just rounding up black people is what they were doing. Of course, all right, so let's see. So Milroy has about 8,300-ish when he starts off. He loses 4,443 of his men, 95 killed, 318 wounded. Ewell loses 47 killed, 219 wounded. So Ewell's coming out ahead here. How he gets medical supplies. He gets cannon.
Sure.
How many pieces of artillery does he get?
So probably at least a dozen.
At least a dozen. That's a pretty good addition there. But now, how about supply though for those guns? Because did they destroy?
So most of those, the ordnance for those guns was largely destroyed, either blown up in the magazines or dumped into wells.
So the Confederacy, who's not quite overloaded with ordnance, what are they going to do with these guns? Are they sending them? They're not taking them with them up to Gettysburg. They're sending them back, right?
Yeah, they've got to go back
Richmond or something.
To Richmond.
They got to be retooled.
Retooled.
Okay.
And repaired.
So, but this is now something that they can add to the cause.
Right.
All right.
And there's Lano says 300 supply wagons, and that's
300 supply wagons, right? So I'm sure they could have used a lot of the supplies in those wagons. Yeah.
And what's interesting, just as a little kind of a sort of a comical moment here, one of the things that a lot of Union soldiers who were captured at Stevenson wrote about is that Confederates were taking musical instruments from the regimental bands.
Yeah.
And there was one Confederate soldier, he had strapped together, 7 or 8, brass instruments and tied them together with a rope. And, this one Union POW, he's obviously mad that he's been captured, but he's like, why are you taking, 8 sax horns with you? What are you going to do with these things?
Right.
So.
Well, and I don't know if this is true or not, but one of the kind of stories I've heard, is it true that Milroy stole the Logan family silver when he left the house and left town?
Oh, so... I think that's one of those stories of local
apocryphal?
lore.
Yeah, okay.
I think, whether it's Ben Butler or Milroy, everybody steals the silver spoons.
Yeah. But how about that, though? So what was the aftermath in the city immediately following the battle like for the civilians? Because now the Confederates are there.
Yeah. So, for the civilians, actually, there's this great moment of joy for the Confederates, Unionists and blacks who are here, obviously not so joyous. For Confederate civilians, there is a great moment of joy, but it doesn't last because, happened after First Kernstown or First Winchester, structures in town were transformed into hospitals. And this has always been interesting to me, regardless of allegiance, whether a Union soldier who's wounded or a Confederate soldier who's wounded, civilians are going out and doing what they can to care for these. So, it's like, okay, for Confederates, we won, Winchester is ours again. But now we have to pick up the debris of battle and care for the wounded and all that kind of stuff. And the situation just becomes further exacerbated after Gettysburg, as those wounded from the Army of Northern Virginia are brought in, ultimately on their way to the General Hospital in Stanton, Virginia.
So this is like a stopping point from Gettysburg. Yeah. And how about for Milroy? How does this whole thing affect the rest of his career?
Yeah, so after Second Winchester, Milroy is arrested by General Halleck's order. And Halleck had charged Milroy with insubordination. He said that, he had defied his order to evacuate Winchester. And Milroy's like, wait a second. I've got the last message I received from my boss, General Schenck, which says, stay put, await further orders, be prepared to withdraw. And so ultimately there was a court of inquiry that took place late summer of 1863, and Milroy was exonerated. So, the disaster that befell his division at Second Winchester, the court of inquiry ultimately, said he followed his orders, the orders that he received. He did what was expected of him. And ultimately, President Lincoln in October of 1863 signed off on the exoneration, and he said, basically words to the effect of, blame isn't always necessary with every disaster. Sometimes bad things just happen. And so,
yes, that's a good message for even all of us today.
Yeah,
right.
And so Lincoln, Lincoln obviously had I think a little bit of a soft spot for Milroy, because he was one of those Union generals from day one who was like, I'm going to aggressively implement the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. The issue for Milroy is, okay, he's been exonerated, but he wants another command. And this is something that Lincoln is reluctant to give him. And so eventually he ends up taking, he has a small command in eastern Tennessee, which is, largely pro-Union area. And he has some success. Like, he defeats Nathan Bedford Forrest in 1864 in eastern Tennessee. And so, but Milroy understands, like, for the rest of his life, his reputation has been tarnished by Second Winchester, even though the court of inquiry said, you're not responsible for this.
Because nobody ever hears the retraction of the story. They only hear the initial story.
It's how it's covered in the press, and he is not treated well in the northern press at all after Second Winchester.
Does he have what does he do after? Like, what's his assignment after? Like, does he finish the war, or is he done?
Does. So he has this command in East Tennessee in 1864, closes out the war in East Tennessee. When the war is over, he is hoping that he can, still stay in the army, whether it's going out west to fight Indians or whatever. He actually wants to go, along with Sheridan to the border with Mexico and deal with everything that's going on there. But ends up working in a variety of roles. He works for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so actually he's quite a strong advocate for rights of Native Americans. Not, let's not screw them over, like has been happening for so long. He ends up living out his final days in Olympia, Washington. He passes away in 1890. And, if this story doesn't reveal how Second Winchester was kind of the epicenter of the remaining years of his life, I don't know what does. So when he was on his deathbed, dying from natural causes, he asked for a judge to come. And, initially, I think if somebody's on their deathbed and somebody says, hey, give me a judge or a legal person, it's like, I'm going to amend my will, right. Or something like that.
Yeah.
And he wants to make one final legal statement that he was not responsible for defeat at Second Winchester. So this really dominated the remaining years of his life. And he had always wanted to be, ever since his childhood. So, he had ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and he wanted to be a great American hero. And he was always looking for that chance. He never had that opportunity, and that bothered him.
Sure.
And I think Winchester, if things would have turned out differently, that could have been that opportunity for him, but that's not what happened.
Anything you want to add or ask?
Well, for coming to the end, I would be remiss not to remind you of Fremantle's comments about Winchester.
Thank you very much.
The terminology he used, and I'll hand that back to you.
Well, I forgot it already. It's the shuttlecock.
He calls it a perfect shuttlecock.
A perfect shuttlecock. Yes. Because it's been going back and forth. It's been changing hands so many times.
The thing from Badminton for the folks.
Yes, exactly.
The birdie.
And that is a good way to describe it. Now, let's bring us up to the modern day. Both of you guys live here. Someone hears this show and they're like, my gosh, I must go down and sit in Starfort where these men recorded this episode. I mean, where those men fought bravely. And But what else do they do? Where else do they go? I'm loving this town, and I'm really going to keep playing the lottery so that I could buy a place here and a place back home. Because this is like my second. It's tied with Harper's Ferry is my second favorite town.
My personal two favorites, Cedar Creek. In my personal opinion, the battle of most consequence in the valley is very well interpreted and very well preserved. And then Third Winchester, battle with the most casualties, probably has tied or a lot of significant. Jonathan's written about veteran activity after the war. They're still putting monuments up on the Third Winchester battlefield. So it's both actively being preserved and still, a great walking park over at Third Winchester. So those two sites are for the individuals that like a classic battlefield with the waysides and the views and the NPS maps and all that. Those are the sites.
That's the place to go. Yeah, because as you go through town, like where we are here, Star Fort, in other places, it's very hard to see what was.
There you have 3 or 4 years that everything cannot be preserved, that were the whole town would just essentially still look like it did in 1865.
And if you come to town, have someone who knows where you're going take you around, and you sit in the passenger seat with maps.
That's right. Yes.
And ask them every once in a while, where are we now? Which direction are we facing? So that you can orient
and
yourself.
If you do come, there's a great book I did see they sell at the courthouse, written by Brandon Beck, who used to work at Shenandoah. It's just called The Three Battles of Winchester. He taught at Shenandoah, not work. And does a great job of kind of starting and giving you distances and modern, things to interpret the field and keep you orientated on the battle.
Oh, good. So that's good. That's handy. How about you?
Yeah, so I think in addition to that, and I'm going to give a shameless plug here. So, McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah, we do a lot, and we actually run and interpret a Civil War battlefield in Clark County. So, Cool Spring Battlefield, the Shenandoah University was gifted back in 2013 195 acres by what is the American Battlefield Trust today. So this is a battle fought in, July 18th, 1864. It's part of the Union pursuit of Jubal Early when Early is coming out of Washington, D.C., fought right along the banks of the Shenandoah River. It is a very pristine site, and we have interpretation out there, and there's waysides and, printed tour guides and those types of things, and it's a site that's free and open to the public all year long.
And it's on a beautiful river, so if you're just looking to see nature, and it's on a former golf course too. So once you drive back there, you're quite secluded and very and
there are within the Winchester Frederick County area. Obviously, you've got Cedar Creek, you've got the Third Winchester Battlefield, Courthouse Museum, Stonewall Jackson's headquarters has a lot of great Jackson artifacts. But
Artajacks, we call them.
Yeah, Artajacks. So, I think if you want to go a little bit further south, Fisher's Hill is another great battlefield site to visit.
Another great one.
There's a lot of sites.
There's a lot of stuff to visit, and a lot of the structures that were here are still standing.
Sure.
And again,
there's that whole walking area down there by the
pedestrian mall downtown. They've done a good job of.
So basically, what you're saying is don't hold Winchester, but stay in Winchester while branching out to these other sites. Where would you recommend people stay? I'm staying at the George Washington Hotel, and it's very nice.
Yeah, the George Washington Hotel is a great hotel.
Yeah.
Beautifully restored. That would be my top recommendation.
Okay, nice. So there you go.
Yeah, that was definitely the one that's going to give you the access to the walking mall in downtown Winchester, not in the outskirts where you have to drive in and find parking to do all the.
You feel kind of fancy though.
Yeah, it's an old hotel. It is. It's a historic building.
There's this cool thing by the elevators. There's a mail slot that I don't know if it actually works anymore or if it's just there as a vestige of the past, but a little slot, and it's got like a plexiglass thing, so I guess you could see the envelope drop down and it would go to the mail room. I'm sure it doesn't actually work anymore, but it's pretty cool. It's an old
it's the block from the walking mall, block from we were talking yesterday. The Patton brothers, other great Civil War stories.
Oh yeah, that was
the cemetery.
Cemetery.
Jackson Cemetery and the National Cemetery. Don't miss the National Cemetery.
See, I don't think a lot of people realize there's a National Cemetery.
The largest monument, Pennsylvania Monument, that was financed by the boys that fought around here.
And you mentioned that Shenandoah University was donated 195 acres. Just so that everybody listening knows, Addressing Gettysburg also takes land donations. As many acres as you want to give us. We'll find something to do with it. All right. And Joe, do you have any questions? Joe, Denise just sitting here. You just joined us a little while ago. No questions? Just enjoy. You come here often, don't you?
Yes, I do.
What would you recommend people do? What do you like to do when you come here?
I like like 3rd Winchester. I like going down a little bit south down the Valley Turnpike, down to Cedar Creek. Pretty down there, and obviously there's a lot of nice breweries, so I partake in those as well when I'm done hiking around all the historical places.
You do love your breweries. You
Yeah,
certainly love
Winchester has been invaded with breweries in the past 10 years.
the
and
whole country.
Yeah.
I mean, everywhere you go.
More $8 pints than you can shake a stick at around here.
You know what? I mean, listen, I love entrepreneurs. I consider myself one, but
My
enough
shameless
with the
plug,
breweries.
Winchester Brew Works, that's my favorite. Those are my homies, so go there.
There you go. Go there. But yeah, everybody who's thinking of opening a brewery, why don't you do this? Find someone who needs a partner and just join them. We enough of the microbrewery. It's no longer special.
Yep.
It's no longer special. All right, no, but seriously though, we all do love those. That's about it for us here from Winchester for the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Second Winchester. I do recommend you get down here. It's a beautiful area of the country. Great little town.
I did forget our
Pretty cool
afternoon plans of Museum of Shenandoah Valley and Glen Burnie. That's good colonial history.
There's
we forgot
so
about.
much stuff to do.
French and Indian War. I mean, you're all the way back, Fort Loudon.
Do you
Great
give
stuff.
tours?
Oh yeah.
You do?
Oh, yeah.
So how would people get a hold of you if they want you to take them on a tour?
You can shoot me an email.
What's
That's
that?
jnoyalas01@su.edu.
All right, slow that down, ladies. Play that back and slow it down.
Or go to the McCormick's Institute website that has a Shenandoah University through.
Yeah.
It's through there and his information.
And we do programs, all throughout the course of the year. Some you have to pay for, some are free. So,
But spring conference, fall conference, spring conference, hasn't said, it was very well attended from all over the country. Brian Matthew Jordan was there, great guests, great people. So.
and if you didn't get to attend, C-SPAN covered the whole thing, so it'll air on C-SPAN in the near future.
There you go. All right, very good. Awesome. Thank you very much for coming, Jonathan. It was really nice
It's been a
meeting you.
pleasure.
Thank you for your time yesterday taking us around,
Absolutely.
too. That was pretty
Glad
neat.
to do it.
And Casey, thank you for setting this up. Big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, back in your cars for Casey, because this is all his doing. So thank you very much for that. Joe, thanks for stopping by. And thank you all for listening. We will talk to you next time. Next episode is July 1st, 1863. So talk to you then. Bye-bye.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, forsooth 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead, follow, drink down ale, and hail, a reckoning on the mail. No man forgets the road to jail from Gary Owen.